going. So welcome to the First Coast Free Thought Society's Zoom room. The First Coast Free Thought Society is an organization of individuals who prefer science and reason over religious dogma and fanaticism. We've enjoyed the non-religious community of Northeast Florida and beyond since 1998. We are also the proud Jacksonville chapter of the American Humanist Association. We are part of a coalition of nonprofit organizations who have come together to advocate for a connected network of parks and green spaces in downtown Jacksonville called Riverfront Parks Now. We are in the happy position to celebrate the First Coast Free Thought Society's 26th year. We are on Facebook, X, Meetup, Instagram, and YouTube. We meet socially in person through our secular Sunday gatherings in the park, our book and movie discussion groups, and sometimes at a local watering hole. Our upcoming book discussion is Twilight of Democracy by Anne Applebaum on April 7th, and our next movie discussion is Lincoln, tomorrow evening, March 19th, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. Our Freethinker newsletter is published monthly, to which we invite your readership and feedback and submissions. A reminder to all contributors, submissions for our April edition are due no later than this Sunday, March 24th. And now you may learn all about everything I just mentioned at our website, fcfs.org. Welcome, everyone. We are all volunteers, yet we incur expenses, largely promotion. We have promoted online, on the radio, and in print. And if you know of a viable place for us to promote, please share it with us. We also have some associated costs for our website and fees for regulatory compliance as a 501c3 charitable organization. So if you can offer us a small membership donation of $15, $20, or any dollar amount, you'll be part of the reason to continue our public outreach. We're tremendously grateful for all who have made donations. We need you and we appreciate you. We look forward to a provocative lineup of exciting speakers over the next few months. We welcome next month in April, gender science Dr. Ann Goldbauer, PhD, RN, board clinical sexologist, and board certified transgender. What is all the hoopla with puberty blockers and trans care for kids? What do we know and what no? What has gone wrong and what has gone well? That intriguing presentation is Monday evening, April 15th. Please RSVP on our meetup page. We'll post the link in the chat. In May, we are excited to have with us Seth Andrews, a well-known, knowledgeable, articulate, funny, favorite atheist and former Christian minister who hosts a podcast called The Thinking Atheist. Then in June, Florida State Representative from District 13, Angie Nixon. Sign on to our meetup page, sign up for our newsletter and email announcement at our website. Stay in touch. If you have an idea for a program, please let us know. Now, tonight, we welcome biology professor Adam Rosenblatt, PhD, who will offer his insights regarding the devastating effects of the escalating climate crisis. Adam Rosenblatt is an assistant professor of biology at the University of North Florida. Before joining the faculty at UNF, he received his PhD from Florida International University. He worked as a research scientist at Yale University and served as a policy fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy. His research focuses on understanding how climate change and urbanization are impacting plants, animals, ecosystems, and with a particular focus on large predators. Since moving to Jacksonville, he has served on the City Council Special Committee on Resiliency and on Mayor Deegan's Transition Committee for Infrastructure. Please use the Zoom hand raise feature found at the reactions button to raise your hand during the Q&A. Should you prefer, you may message a question via the Zoom chat. Now let's mute our mic until it's time to speak. Please know we are recording the presentation for posterity. As a side note, we don't know what might be said during our discussions. We are open to the public. Sometimes we cringe and sometimes we nod in quiet approval, and sometimes we cheer. So let's begin by appreciating Dr. Rosenblatt for graciously offering us his time, expertise, and insight. So Adam, we are all yours. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for that very generous introduction. Thanks for having me today. Let me share my screen. I have a little presentation that I'd like to share with you all. Let's see here. Let's make this from the beginning. There we go. Okay. So, yeah, as was said, I am going to talk with you all today about Jacksonville and the climate crisis. We're going to talk about the climate crisis and what's going on globally, and then we're going to talk about what's going on locally here in Jacksonville and what sort of the latest news is. I'm sure you're all aware at a sort of broad level about what's going on in the climate crisis, but there have been some, more recent developments that people should be aware of, and I'll dive into some of those today. So just to give a broad background, I know that many of you are probably familiar with the data that I'm going to show you, at least in this early part, but just to make sure that we all are on the same page and understand what's going on. Climate change is accelerating, and this graph here just shows how temperatures have been increasing over the past, 60 odd years or so. Since about the 1950s, we've seen a very steady positive trend in temperatures increasing globally. And what we have noticed, the sort of broad conclusions that we can draw from this, is that every decade since 1950 has been warmer than the one before it, on average, right? The average temperature of each decade has been warmer. The 9 hottest years on record have been the last 9 years. And that shows no signs of slowing down this year. This year is either going to be, 2024 is projected to be either the hottest year on record or the second or third hottest year on record. 2023, the year that just ended, was set the new record for the hottest year. And this is an interesting new piece of information. Every month since June of last year has been the hottest month ever. So June of 2023 was the hottest June ever, and then July was the hottest July ever. The February that just ended, that was the hottest February that we've ever had. And so again, we just keep breaking these temperature records. And again, these are global temperature records. And we just keep breaking them month after month, year after year. And it shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. If you would like another way to visualize this temperature change, this next graph shows that here. I like this one. This goes all the way back to 1940. It shows every single year going back to 1940, and the average for that year, and for each month, each of the little pie slices is 1 month of the year. And it compares the average temperature for that month and for that year to the average for the entirety of 1971 to 2020. So it basically, we take a 50-year average temperature, and then we compare the average temperature in each month and year to that long-term average. And you can see that it's the last 9 years that are the hottest of the hot. This was a graph from before 2023 was completed, so you can see that final circle in the bottom in the middle is not completed yet, because it was 2023 wasn't over when this graphic was made. And this is a map of the planet on the hottest day ever recorded. The hottest single average day ever recorded on the planet was last year, July 4th. As luck would have it, or as unluck would have it. And this shows which parts of the planet on that day were really driving things. You can see the legend at the bottom that the hottest temperatures are the ones that are in sort of the gray zone. Obviously, the red and the orange are also incredibly hot. So the hottest parts of the world on that day were West Africa, the Middle East, parts of Pakistan and India. Those were, approaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit on that day. You can also see in the United States, right, where we live in the Southeast was incredibly hot. Into the Caribbean was boiling hot. All over the globe, there's just heat records falling all the time. This map, I like this map just because it gives a snapshot of really what that looks like on a global scale. Now, why this is happening is because of greenhouse gas emissions. And this graph here just shows all of the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution back in the 1700s, and which countries are responsible for their proportion of it. And so right now, this current year, China is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions out of all the countries in the world. But of course, we need to keep in mind that China has 4 times or 3 times as many people as the United States does. So on a per person basis, you can see the United States down there in the dark blue at the lower part of this graph. So on a per person basis, every American is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than every Chinese person, right? So China as a whole is putting out more greenhouse gases than the United States as a whole, but on a per person basis, we are still the world leaders. And if you add up all of the historical emissions going back to the 1750s, the United States is the clear leader in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'll show you a graph later that shows that the US emissions have actually been declining somewhat slowly since about 2005, which is great. But they're not declining quickly enough for our liking. And that's why the US still is the world leader in per person greenhouse gas emissions. But you can see from this graph, which areas of the globe are the most responsible, right? It's the United States, it's the European Union, it's China, it's India, and then kind of everybody else, right? So it's really a relatively small proportion of the planet that is driving this, and these are, the richest, some of the richest countries on the planet, right? And that's what's happening. The countries in Africa are not contributing almost anything to the climate crisis. Most of the countries in South America, except for Brazil, are not contributing that much, right? Most of the countries in Asia are not contributing as much as these other, large economies that I've already mentioned. And what's happening from a physics perspective is that as we put these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we are thickening the warming blanket that is, sits in the atmosphere over the planet. It's natural to have this blanket of greenhouse gases, right, at a certain level, and that's what keeps our planet warm, which is great. But what we're doing is we are thickening that blanket, right? And as the blanket gets thicker with carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor and all kinds of different, greenhouse gases, as that blanket gets thicker, it still allows all of the sun's energy through it, right? As light, it comes through that blanket. But then when it re-radiates back out into space, or tries to re-radiate back out into space as heat instead of as light, that's when it gets trapped by the greenhouse gas emissions. And so we are currently trapping more of that heat than we did in the past. Just to put it in a different perspective about how much heat is being trapped on the planet, this graph really does the job. This shows the amount of extra heat energy that has been trapped either in the ocean, at the upper levels of the ocean. That's the light blue. The dark blue is the deeper part of the ocean. And then the red is everything else. It's all the land and the ice and the atmosphere. Most of the heat on the planet is trapped in the oceans, just because, again, the laws of physics, water holds heat better than the air does, or better than anything else does, really. So about 90% of all of the extra heat that's been trapped on the planet because of our greenhouse gas emissions has ended up in the oceans. And if you want to look at the units here, I don't expect you to know what these units are, but on the left-hand side, we're measuring this in joules, right? Joule is a physics term. It's a measure of energy. In this case, it's a measure of heat energy. And you can see that since the 1960s, because of our greenhouse gas emissions, we've trapped an extra 20 times 10 to the 22nd joules of heat energy. And again, I don't expect you to know what that number means or be able to visualize that number. It's just a number, right? But a way to think about in more concrete terms how much heat is being trapped on the planet is that this amount that I've just told you is equivalent to 4 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs worth of heat added to the climate system every second of every day since the 1960s. Because, you can picture a nuclear bomb going off, you can picture a mushroom cloud going up, and as a nuclear bomb explodes, it releases a huge amount of heat energy. And what we're trapping is 4 of those, Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs, to the climate system every single second of every day, which really, puts a point on what we are doing to this planet.
Adam,
Yeah.
I apologize. Can you go back to the, I am confused, but please, everybody forgive me. I'm confused by this slide. When it says ocean heat content, is that the depth that the heat goes in the ocean? I don't even know that I understand this slide. Please forgive my stupidity.
No. There's no stupid questions here. Thank you for the question. So this is, the light blue is how much heat is held in the ocean down to 700 meters, from the surface down to 700 meters. And then the dark blue is everything from 700 meters down to 2,000 meters. So it's basically the upper part of the ocean and then the deeper part of the ocean. And then the red is all the heat that's stored on land and in the atmosphere and the air above us and in the ice caps, basically.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for asking the question. And please feel free to interrupt me if anything's confusing. I'm not trying to confuse anybody, but sometimes I do go a little bit quickly. So thank you for asking that question. So that's the past. That's all the heat that's already been trapped on the planet and the amount of warming that's already happened. This graph here shows where we're headed, okay, which is, of course, what we are the most concerned about. And you can see there are a bunch of different possible pathways of warming that we could end up on. So let me just break this down for you. The black line on the left is what we've already seen in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases that have already been put into the atmosphere and have ended up in the ocean, some of them. And then the various lines, the dark gray at the top down to the dark blue at the bottom, those are possible pathways we could be on in terms of how much average global warming we would see by 2100, right? And there's good news and bad news on this graph. The good news is that you see that top line where it says we could get to 5 degrees centigrade of global average warming by 2100. That pathway is not really possible anymore, right? And the same goes for the 4 degree centigrade pathway. So those two worst case scenario pathways we're not going to reach that level, which is great news, because if we got to 4 or 5 degrees centigrade of global average warming, it would be basically the end of human civilization for the most part. So we're not headed in that direction, and there's very low probability that we're going to end up in that place, which is good news. The bad news is that we're still headed for quite a bit of warming, not meaning the end of human civilization, but meaning a lot of suffering and of people and non-human animals around the globe. So there's a line here that is sort of red, right? And that red line is where we're headed in terms of the current policies that governments all around the globe have put into place to try to control greenhouse gas emissions. If we stay on that line, we will end up somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees of warming Celsius by the end of this century. Then you can see there's a lighter line that's kind of yellow or orange that says pledged policies. Those are the policies that governments around the world have said they are going to put into place over the next several decades to try to bring down greenhouse gas emissions even further, right? So that's not stuff that's happening yet, but it's what governments have said they are going to do. That could be taking, combustion engines off the road, right? And moving over to electric vehicles. That could be transitioning from, using coal and oil to generate electricity and natural gas to, solar and wind, right? Those are pledged policies. And so that would get us below 2.5 degrees of global warming, but 2.5 is still pretty bad. The dark blue line on the bottom is the line that we as a global community said that we were going to try to keep our greenhouse gas emissions to as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. You might remember all the countries in the world, including our own country, signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And what we said was we were going to do what we were going to try to, we were going to set a goal of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And you can see how far away we are from that line. And in fact, pretty much everybody in the climate science community agrees at this point that keeping warming to 1.5 is impossible. We're not going to be able to do that because we've delayed action for too long. And there's almost no way that we can meet that goal. So now the new goal is to try to keep warming below 2 degrees centigrade, right? But you can see on our current pathway, right, with the current policies, we're looking at somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees centigrade of global warming by the end of this century. So with that in mind, we can talk about what's going to happen in Jacksonville, because we have the ability with these very fancy climate models to make predictions, pretty well-informed predictions about what's going to happen in Duval County specifically. And that's where we live, and that's what we care about. I mean, we care about the global, community, but we, of course, care more about where we live. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in Jacksonville. First, let's talk about sea level rise, because we're obviously a coastal city. This is how the sea level has changed right off the coast of Mayport since the 1930s. So this is data from a buoy that, just records sea level rise on a very regular basis. It's operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration right off Naval Station Mayport. And what this shows is that since 1930, sea level has risen by about 9 inches, right? So that's about 1 inch of sea level rise per decade for the last 9 decades, which doesn't sound terrible, but remember this, it adds up on itself over time, right? And it accumulates over time, and it makes storm surge worse, and it makes hurricanes worse, and it makes, sunny day flooding worse. But so that's what's happened in the past. The prediction for sea level rise for the future looks like this, and it says that by 2050, we're looking at an additional 15 inches of sea level rise. So remember what I told you before, we've seen 9 inches in the past 90 years, and now we're looking at 15 inches just in the next 30 years, or actually the next 25 years at this point. So clearly sea level rise is accelerating, and this dark red line here, that's the scenario that's most likely, according to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is the government agency that is responsible for helping, different cities and communities and regions around the country control flooding and water issues. So, the actual amount of sea level rise could be anywhere in that sort of lighter red region. But the dark red line is the most likely scenario, according to the Army Corps. And that would be very bad for this city if we reach 15 inches of additional sea level rise, because this map here will show what would happen by 2050. If we have 15 inches of sea level rise, as is predicted, then all the blue areas on this map would flood once per year on average. Now, that's an average, right? So some years there would be no flooding in some of these areas, and other years, the areas might flood 2 or 3 or 4 times just in one year, but the average is once per year. And you can see the parts of the city that would be most affected. The intracoastal waterway would be hit very hard by this. But pretty much anywhere along a water body, right? You can see Ortega River, Doctors Lake, Julington Creek, Trout River up in the northern part of the city of Duval County. All of these areas would see significant impacts from increased rates of flooding, right? And this is, people's homes and businesses would be impacted by this, clearly. The other thing we have to worry about is warming. We talk a lot about sea level rise in Duval County because we are a coastal city. But we also have to worry about heat. Sorry, you want to come here? Come in. Sorry, one of my children wants to come and sit on my lap, so I'm just going to have him come and sit on my lap. You want to come and join us? Oh, he just got out of the bath and he wanted to talk to me. This is Leo. Leo, you want to say hi to everybody? No, you just want to stare blankly at the screen. That's fine too.
How old is he?
So in terms of heat, we are already a very hot city, and we are going to get even hotter, unfortunately. And this sort of figure here shows what that's going to look like. So historically, going back to the 1970s, it's all good. So historically, don't worry, that crying is normal. So historically, going back to the 1970s, Jacksonville has seen about 3 days per year on average where the temperature has gone above 105 degrees. And those are heat index days. So that's where the humidity plus the temperature, that's the temperature you feel in your skin is the heat index, right? This is not raw temperature. So going back to the 1970s, 3 days per year where that temperature, where we reach that heat index. By the middle of this century, if we continue on the current pathway, we're looking at 46 of those days per year. And by the end of the century, we're looking at 91 of those days per year, right? And the reason why I chose 105 degrees as sort of the cutoff point for this graph is that above that temperature, it's really dangerous to be outside. This is a public health nightmare, right? And the people who are most susceptible to heat-related issues, health issues, are the very young and the elderly, right? They have the bodies that are least able to regulate body temperature. And so those are the groups of people who are most affected by heat stress, heat stroke, end up in the emergency room. And what a lot of people don't realize, which is very sobering to think about, is that heat is the #1 killer of people across the entire planet, and in Florida and in the United States at large, when it comes to weather-related disasters, right? Like most people think that hurricanes kill a lot of people, or tornadoes or flooding, but it's actually heat kills more people than anything else. And so by the end of this century, we're looking at basically 3 months out of the year where the heat index every single day is above 105. And those are summer months, right? That's like basically June, July, and August, every single day hotter than 105 degrees. And that amount of heat would not be evenly distributed across the city. This is a map just showing some data that I collected that was this is a project that was funded by the city of Jacksonville and also by the federal government. We collected this data back in 2022, the summer of 2022 in June. And myself and a bunch of volunteers that we recruited, we went out across the city and we collected heat and humidity data to see how heat levels differ across different parts of the city. And I just want you to take note of the legend up in the upper left, where the coolest parts of the city on the day that we took these data was 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hottest was about 116, right? So there's about a 20-degree difference in terms of the heat index that different neighborhoods in Jacksonville feel. And you can see the parts of the city that are the most affected. It's downtown Jacksonville is incredibly hot. The east side, down in Mandarin along the coast is incredibly hot. Out towards Jacksonville Beach and Ponte Vedra Beach, it gets hot when you're just like not literally on the beach, but when you're just back from the beach, like a couple of blocks, that's where that heat really starts to build up. So you can see that different neighborhoods are going to be affected differently, and those parts of the city that are going to have the worst heat stress are going to need the most help to avoid a lot of these public health problems, right? Then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of Jacksonville is hurricanes, because of course we have to worry about hurricanes here. We're all aware of this. And what I can tell you about hurricanes is that the projections are not that the number of hurricanes is going to increase. So we're anticipating seeing the same number, roughly on average, the same number of hurricanes every year for the foreseeable future. But what we are already seeing, and what we're going to continue to see, is that every hurricane that forms is more likely to be a Category 4 or Category 5, and they're also more likely to drop more rain, right? And also to move more slowly, interestingly. And the reason for this is that hurricanes get their energy from the ocean, right? And if the ocean is trapping more heat, as I've already shown you, then that means there's just more energy that hurricanes can draw on to become bigger and stronger. And just to put it in perspective, how dangerous these hurricanes have become, between 1970 and 2016, there were only 4 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes that made landfall in the US, right? So that's like about 45 years worth of hurricanes. It was very rare for the strongest hurricanes to make landfall in the US. That's about one, less than 1 per decade. And in between 2017 and 2023, we've had 7 make landfall, right? We've had 7 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes make landfall in the past 7 years. So clearly you can see how hurricane risk is increasing, not just in the not the total number of hurricanes again, but just the power of each hurricane is getting worse and more destructive. So we all need to be worried about everything that I've talked about so far, but I want to give you just one example of what's happening to ecosystems, right? To the ecosystems that we rely on as human beings for our food, for our recreation, for everything that kind of makes living worthwhile, right? And makes it possible to live on this planet. There's a lot of different examples I could give you, but the one I'm going to give you is about coral reefs. Corals are one of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet because of global warming right now. And that's because they are very sensitive to changes in temperature, right? And we already talked about how the ocean temperature is increasing dramatically. The reason that it's a problem is because the way that, if you've never thought or read anything about corals, the way that corals work is, or at least warm water corals, the way that they work is that they have a partnership with these other organisms called zooxanthellae. And the zooxanthellae photosynthesize, and they provide food for the corals, and then the corals provide a home for the zooxanthellae. This is what we call a mutualism, where you have 2 different groups of organisms helping each other out in some way, right? So that's the normal situation. What happens, though, is that when the zooxanthellae get really hot, when the water gets really hot, the zooxanthellae get stressed out. And when they get stressed out, they stop photosynthesizing and they start releasing toxins. And so they're basically poisoning their host, the corals. And what the corals do in response is they get rid of the zooxanthellae. They kick them out of their tissues, right? Because they say, if you're not going to feed me anymore, you're just going to hurt me. I'm going to get rid of you, right? And the problem is that if the corals do not find new zooxanthellae partners within a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then they will die, right? They won't be able to recover from that because they won't have a food source anymore. And that's what we call coral bleaching. And this is what this looks like. On the left, you can see a healthy coral with its normal color. And then as it gets really hot and the zooxanthellae get ejected from the coral tissue, you can see that coral start to change color. And then eventually it becomes bleached. It becomes fully white. And that's when they are most at risk of dying. And so the reason I bring up the corals is because the predictions for corals are incredibly bad. This was a report put out by the United Nations back in 2018, where you'll recall the nations of the world all agreed in the Paris Climate Agreement to try to keep warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. I've already talked about how we're not going to be able to do that. But when this report was put out, a bunch of countries, especially in the South Pacific, were asking the United Nations, hey, if we're going to try to keep warming to 1.5, you need to give us some information about what that's going to mean in terms of sea level rise and in terms of, the fish and the corals that we depend on for our survival. And so this is the best, scientists in the world getting together and trying to make predictions about what's going to happen at 1.5. And they specifically had a section on corals. And this is that section. And what they said was, I highlighted it here for you. Coral reefs, for example, are projected to decline by a further 70 to 90% at 1.5 degrees C of warming, with larger losses of more than 99% at 2 degrees C of warming. The risk of irreversible loss of many marine and coastal ecosystems increases with global warming, especially at 2 degrees centigrade. So just to make sure we're understanding what this means, right? I've already told you that it's pretty much impossible for us to keep warming to 1.5. We're going to blow past that. But even if we're able to keep warming to 2 degrees centigrade, the world's best coral scientists are telling us that almost all the corals are going to be gone. And this prediction is not for the end of this century. It's not for 2100. It's for the middle of this century. It's for about 2050. So we're talking about in the next 25 years, we are talking about more than 99% of all of the warm water corals on the planet disappearing, right? That's the situation that we're in. And the reason this is horrible is because there's a huge number of people around the globe who depend on corals for their food, right? In terms of fish and crabs and lobsters and all those kinds of things. And there's an even larger proportion of people who depend on corals for ecotourism, right? Like including, the Florida Keys, right? The Florida Keys, the corals in the Florida Keys are a huge driver of tourism in that area, brings a lot of money, sustains a lot of businesses, sustains a lot of families, right? And that's true throughout the Caribbean, throughout, southern Mexico, throughout Southeast Asia, anywhere that has, Australia, obviously, with the Great Barrier Reef. And the prediction is that all of these coral reefs are going to be gone within the next 25 years. This is just an example of what that looked like last year. 2023, as I said, was the hottest year ever recorded. And it was also the hottest temperatures ever recorded in the oceans. In fact, the hottest temperature, this is a shocking statistic, the hottest temperature, ocean temperature ever recorded on the planet, as far as we know, happened off the coast of the Florida Keys just last year. And that temperature was 101 degrees. Which is, that's bathtub temperature. That's hot tub temperatures, right? Like hot tubs get up to that level of heat. And that's what it was in the ocean, not for the entire summer, but on a particular day off the coast of, I believe it was Key Largo. There was a sensor, there was a buoy that recorded a temperature of it was actually more than 101 degrees. It was between 101 and 102. And this is a picture, an aerial picture of one of the coral reefs in the Florida Keys and what it looked like before the temperatures in the ocean got incredibly hot back in June, and then what they looked like after about 3 weeks of really hot temperatures. And you can see on the left, there's a bunch of corals that are looking their normal color, and on the right, you can see them all bleached. On this one reef in the Keys, which is called Chica Rocks, it's offshore of Isla Morada. 100% of the corals bleached, right? There was not a single coral that did not bleach in this extreme marine heat wave. So the other thing to remember on top of all this, right, is that climate change is not the only thing that's happening. We have a bunch of other human-caused issues that are exacerbating what climate change is doing, right? These things are all happening at the same time. Land use change, pollution in terms of trash and chemicals, pollution in terms of too many nutrients entering the water, pollution in terms of light in the sky, too much overhunting, too much overfishing, right? All these things are happening simultaneously, and it's making it very difficult for animals and plants and the ecosystems that we depend on to survive. And the corals are just an example of that, what that looks like. And what this all means put together is that we are at the start of the 6th mass extinction. And this graph shows what it looks like, what the situation is we're in. Now, let me just explain what this graph is and how it works. This data goes back to, 1500. So this is based on the fossil record, right? We have predictions about how many species should go extinct every century. And you can see that dotted line at the bottom of the graph. That's called the background extinction rate. That's what we would predict in terms of how many species should be going extinct if this were a normal situation. And you can see that that is a very low percentage. It's about 0.02% of all the species on the planet, all the animal species on the planet, should be going extinct every 100 years. But you can see where we are with these other colored lines, you know, that show birds and mammals and all the other vertebrate species on the planet put together, that the current extinction rate is much, much higher than that. Like for mammals, it's the highest, right? We're at a 2% extinction rate for mammals. So 2% of all the mammals on the planet are going extinct every 100 years at this point. And that extinction rate is accelerating. And these heightened extinction rates are what put us into the zone of a sixth mass extinction. Let me show you this next graph here, which really shows the mass extinction and how we sort of measure up to what's happened in the past. There have been 5 mass extinctions on the planet previously, going back hundreds of millions of years, and each of the spikes on this graph is one of those mass extinction events. The definition of a mass extinction event, by the way, is that more than 75% of all the species on the planet go extinct within 2 million years. And I just want to draw your attention to the worst one, which is this one in the middle. It's called the End Permian mass extinction. It happened about 250 million years ago. And you can see that during this mass extinction event, 96% of the species on the planet went extinct, right? Which is, I mean, that's more than any other mass extinction event. Now, what's scary about this, and then so you can see where we are over here on the far right, that's where we are right now. We're at the start of the 6th mass extinction, and there's a bunch of different lines here showing different trajectories we could take. We don't know where we're going to end up, right? But at our current pace, we are going to, continue the 6th mass extinction. So here's the scary thing about this, okay, is that the cause of the End Permian mass extinction was climate change. And it wasn't climate change caused by people, obviously. It was climate change caused by a large series of volcanoes erupting in Siberia in a very short period of time, right? And they put huge amounts of carbon dioxide and methane and all kinds of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere in a relatively short period of time. And it caused acid rain, and it caused the oceans to heat up, and everything we're seeing right now, right? And that's what caused 96% of the species on the planet to go extinct within 2 million years. We are currently, at this moment in time, seeing greenhouse gas emissions rates that are faster than what happened in the End Permian. So just to summarize that again, the End Permian is the worst mass extinction event ever recorded on this planet because, and it was caused by climate change, and our current rate of climate change is faster than what was happening back then. And that is very scary, obviously. So let's think about what Jacksonville is doing about all of this, because different cities, different countries, different states are taking different tactics for how to deal with climate change and what's going on. And I was part of this effort to try to get Jacksonville to put together a plan for how to deal with what's happening to the city. And that resulted in this report called Resilient Jacksonville, which was released by the city's chief resilience officer just in last October of 2023. It was a 2-year-long effort to put this whole report together. You can go find it online for yourself. You can download a copy of it. You can look through it. It's very detailed. It's very extensive. It's about 200 pages long. I was one of the subject matter experts who helped put this thing together and talk about, basically, we give recommendations to the mayor and to the city council about what the city should be doing to try to prepare for sea level rise increasing and for heat increasing and for all the issues that we're already facing, how they're going to get worse in the future. And this is a 50-year-long plan, right? So this is a plan for 5 decades of what the city can do to make the city more resilient to the changes that are happening. And this is a great plan. It's the best plan the city has ever put together. And I'm not just saying that because I was part of putting it together, but I mean, it was a very comprehensive process. The problem with the plan is that it does nothing to address the root cause of climate change, right? There's nothing in the plan about trying to bring down greenhouse gases. And part of that is because the state of Florida has made it incredibly difficult legally and this is since Governor DeSantis came into office. They've, the Florida legislature, along with the governor, have passed a series of bills, a series of laws, state laws, that have basically made it impossible for cities like Jacksonville or any local municipalities to try to bring down their own greenhouse gas emissions. I won't get into the details of what all those bills are, because I don't want to, get too deep into the weeds with you. I'm happy to talk about it if anybody has any questions about it afterwards. But I'm not saying it's not the city's fault, right? The current mayor, Donna Deegan, wants to be more proactive about climate change, but in a lot of ways, her hands are kind of tied in terms of actually dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, unfortunately. So to get to the question that was sort of posed by this talk, by the promotion of this talk, was, is it too late? And the answer is yes and no. It's too late for some things. It's not too late for other things in terms of reducing the most negative consequences of climate change. So it's too late to keep global warming to 1.5, right? I've already talked about that. That's basically a pipe dream at this point. It's impossible. So that it is too late for that. Right? But it is not too late to keep global warming to 2 degrees centigrade. And 2 degrees centigrade is worse than 1.5, but 2 is way better than 2.5 or 3, right? With every, incremental amount of warming that continues, the situation on the planet gets worse and worse, right? In terms of all the things we've talked about, sea level rise, drought, wildfires, all the heat, right? Those things get progressively worse as the average temperature of the globe rises. So whatever we can keep it to, we should try to keep it to that, right? And currently the goal is 2, and 2 is possible. It's not probable at this point in time, but it is possible for us to do that if we can sort of get our act together. So what can we do as a group to have an impact on this very dire situation that we're in? I'm going to tell you a couple of things that you can do and that we can do as a group. I'm listing them from the most important to the least important. Okay, so the most important thing is first, the least important thing is last. Okay, and the most important thing that we can do, all of us, is to vote. And it's the best thing about it is that it's the most important thing and it's the easiest thing to do, right? I mean, voting is not difficult, despite what the media tries to tell us, right? If you make a plan, of course. And the reason that that's the most important thing to do is because voting has consequences, very big consequences when it comes to climate change. Just as an example, right? Back in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law by President Biden, and it was the largest investment that our country has ever made in fighting climate change. This bill dedicated about $370 billion to dealing with climate change. And our country had never made an investment like that before, a financial investment like that before. And, it's all sorts of things. It makes it cheaper for people to buy electric cars. It makes it cheaper for people to, install heat pumps in their house for air conditioning, right? It makes it cheaper for utilities to switch over to wind power and solar power. There's all of these different aspects to the bill that are trying to make it easier to get away from fossil fuels and get away from greenhouse gas emissions and get towards renewable energy. And this bill only came about because President Biden was elected, right? Like it's most people don't realize this, but President Biden is actually he has the most success of any president in the history of our country in terms of fighting climate change. And this bill is the reason why. Just to show you what this would do or what this is going to do, in the Paris Climate Agreement, our country pledged to reduce our country's greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. And you can see that little red triangle in the bottom corner. That's the target that we set for ourselves in Paris. And this blue line here shows the amount of greenhouse gases that the amount of decrease in greenhouse gas emissions that we've already seen since 2005, right? And if we did not have the Inflation Reduction Act, then we would have seen a further, we would have seen a total 27% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which is obviously less than 50%, which is what we said we were going to do. With the Inflation Reduction Act, we are looking at 40% of decreases in greenhouse gas emissions. Still doesn't get us to our goal of 50%, but it's way better than 27%, right? So that's just an example of the consequence of good climate policy. There's a lot more that we need to do, but 40% is a big step in the right direction. And then this was a fascinating analysis that was just released about 2 weeks ago by this organization called Carbon Brief that does all these different kinds of independent analyses of climate plans. And they showed the consequences of the next presidential election, which is that a victory for Donald Trump would mean an additional 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, compared to the plans that Joe Biden has publicly talked about for if he's reelected. And this, this analysis, it makes a lot of assumptions, right? This is going off of what both candidates have said publicly about what they would do regarding climate change, right? Like Donald Trump has said publicly that he would remove our country from the Paris Climate Agreement. He has said publicly that he would try to get rid of most of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And Joe Biden has said publicly that he would try to expand on the work that he started in terms of climate legislation during his, during the term that he's in right now. So this is just showing the difference between candidates, right? And if you don't know what 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions looks like, it is twice, it's double all the savings that have occurred worldwide from deploying wind, solar, and other clean technologies over the past 5 years. So over the past 5 years, all the countries of the world have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount. And if Donald Trump is elected and there's another 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions put into the atmosphere, an extra 4 billion tons, then that would negate twice over all of the progress that the world has made in the past 5 years. So the next most important thing is to talk to other people about climate change and talk to them about voting, because we don't talk about it enough. There was a fascinating study that was done, I think 2 years ago now, where these sociologists were trying to figure out how often does somebody need to hear about climate change to take action on climate change. Action meaning voting or, volunteering with a group that works on climate change, whatever it might be. Doesn't have to be like a big action, but any action at all. And what they found out was that the average American has to hear about climate change, from TV, from their friends, from their family, from, a podcast, from the radio, whatever the form is. They have to hear about climate change 80 times a month to be motivated to take action. So that's more than twice a day, right? And the long and short of it is people don't think about climate change in their daily life that much because we don't really talk about it that much as a society. And so the next thing you can do after voting is to talk to people about what you've learned here today and about the importance of voting for causing some change, some positive change. The next thing is joining a group that's doing the climate change work already, right? None of us can solve this problem on our own. There are lots of organizations out there that are bringing people together to, encourage collective action when it comes to climate change. Groups like Citizens Climate Lobby, the Environmental Voter Project, 350.org. These are just a couple examples. There's lots of them out there. These are just the ones that I'm most familiar with that are doing great work on trying to move the needle on climate change at the local and national levels. And if you want to be a part of this movement, which I encourage you all to do, you can join one of these groups and you can, learn how to be part of the solution, a larger part of the solution than you might already be. And there's also very local groups here in Jacksonville doing great work. The North Florida Land Trust, St. John's Riverkeeper, the local chapter of the Sierra Club, all do great work locally here in terms of preserving land, protecting endangered species, and also fighting the good fight on climate change issues. By the way, just a brief plug, I am the leader of the Citizens Climate Lobby chapter here in Jacksonville. It's an organization that advocates for common sense climate legislation at the federal level. So we talk to our senators, we talk to our members of the House of Representatives on a regular basis, and we talk about the bills that we want them to support, specific climate change bills that we want them to co-sponsor. And then the last thing is the very last thing, and it's also the least important thing, is making better personal choices when possible in your own lifestyle, right? And again, this is the least important thing to do, but it is still something that I encourage all of you to do. I try to do some of these things. I'm not perfect, right? I still do things that are bad for the environment, bad for climate change, but I do my best, and I encourage you all to do your best as well. Just some brief examples. Eating less meat is a big one in terms of impacting the climate less. Flying and driving less, which I know is very difficult to do here in Jacksonville because this is a driving city. Consuming consciously, what I mean by that is, anything that you buy has a climate impact, and some things are better than others, right? When it comes to food, when it comes to clothing, when it comes to appliances, anything that you're buying, there's probably something out there, a version of it out there that is better for the climate than what you're buying, right? And so I encourage you just to be more conscious about your consumption choices and try to be more well-informed about the impacts of those choices. And then the last one is taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives. You can go to this website, rewiringamerica.org. This website gives a step-by-step walkthrough of all of the different parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that you can use as an individual to try to reduce your carbon footprint and to get help from the government for doing it, right? You can get tax write-offs and tax refunds for buying an electric car, for installing a heat pump at your house, for installing an electric water heater, for installing solar panels on your roof, right? There's all these things that the government will help cover the cost of. And I encourage you to look at what some of those things are and see if there are, opportunities in your own life that you can take advantage of some of these incentives. I've done this already in my own house, not all of them, but some of them. And it, helps me feel like I'm contributing to the solution a little bit more than, I do already. So my last thing that I'm going to tell you before we open it up for questions, this is the hopeful part, okay? I've been presenting a lot of depressing information to you because it is a depressing topic, and I want you to be informed about the reality of the situation. But the hopeful part is that we have conquered these kinds of problems before, okay? We have encountered problems not exactly like climate change, but similar, and we have solved them, right, as a global human society. And we should be proud of that. And we should take it as evidence that we can do it again, okay? So examples of that. Acid rain used to be a huge environmental problem. We don't really have to worry about acid rain anymore because we put regulations in place to limit the things that were causing acid rain. The ozone hole used to be a huge concern. Not really anymore because we dealt with it, the cause of it. We got rid of the chemicals. We mostly stopped using the chemicals that were causing the ozone hole, and now the ozone hole is repairing itself. DDT used to be a huge pesticide that we were using all across the world, especially in the United States, and it was having massive environmental impacts, and we got wise to it and we stopped using it. We outlawed it. We don't use it anymore, right? We've brought some endangered species back from the brink. That is a very difficult thing to do, and we have done it in some cases. We haven't done it in every case, but in some cases we have saved species from going extinct, and that is amazing when you think about it. We've conquered deadly and debilitating diseases that were the scourge of, human populations all across the planet. We don't really have to worry about smallpox and polio and, mumps and rubella and measles. We don't have to worry about them as much as we used to. And that is a huge, victory for our species. So we've been able to do this, right? We have the tools to solve climate change. We just have to do it. We have to use the tools. And we have to get past the political and the financial barriers that are being, erected to try to stop it from happening. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but if we work together and, put a lot of pressure on our, political leaders and our business leaders, we can make it happen. So I'm going to leave it there. Happy to answer any questions anybody has and talk more about anything that people want to discuss. Thanks for your time.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Adam. Would you kindly unshare your screen at this point? So that gives me a better view of the folks who are there. Thank you, Adam. I appreciate that. And if you do have a comment or a question, we've been given a lot of information. So please raise your emoji hand. Oh, I see there's a bunch of people here. Okay, let's start. Let's go down the row and start with Susan. Hey, Susan, how are you?
Hi, thank you. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask one and then I'll get back in line. So my question is, they were going to build the restaurant at the landing a little further back, and now they've moved it right onto the edge of the river. And I was wondering if our guest thinks that's a bad idea. And I also wonder, I think this is a related, that's why it's just one question, is the beaches aren't going to get flooded. Why are they having to do the renovations of the beaches? And I'll get back in line. Thank you.
Great question. So I'll do the beaches one first. The reason that the beaches are not as exposed or vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding as you saw on the intracoastal is because the beaches have the dune system, right? And the dune system it's not going to stop all flooding and all, the effects of storm surges and hurricanes and everything. But the dune system is a natural barrier to these kinds of issues that the intracoastal waterway does not have, right? The intracoastal waterway does not have that kind of protection. So that's kind of that's the short answer for what's going on the beaches specifically. And then for the landing, I believe, my personal opinion is that the city should not be developing any land along any waterway property, any further development of waterway, land. In general. Now, when it comes to the landing specifically, that area is already reinforced by there's like I'm not forgetting the name of it, but it's hardened. It's a hardened shoreline that has been, it's like reinforced with concrete, right? And it stops, the river from flooding that area. So that area there's already been money dedicated to protecting that area from, the worst effects of sea level rise. But you're right, building anything along the riverfront, even in those areas that are already protected, it's going to be vulnerable to flooding in the future. That's the thing that always gets me about the whole, Shad Khan development, talk, right? About like, Lot J and all that riverfront property that his company has purchased and what they want to, put a Four Seasons there, and they want to do all this business development. And I understand the motivation for it, obviously, the economic motivation. But over the next several decades, that land is going to be more at risk, and it's going to require more money to protect it from storm surge and from sunny day flooding. So yeah, personally, I am not in favor of further developing that land. I think that land should be set aside for parks and for areas that are more able to absorb water more easily.
As a personal observation, thank you for your answer, but as a personal observation regarding the dune system at the beach, I can attest that the dunes were replaced and regrown since 2016 after Hurricane Matthew. They were taken out by Hurricane Matthew, which was not a direct hit on Jacksonville. And the beach has been renourished by the Army Corps of Engineers every 3 to 4 years at a great expense to the taxpayers of Jacksonville and Jacksonville Beach. So here's my question to you, and then we'll go to Richard. Adam, all economics aside, would you buy a condo at the beach?
No, I would not. And in fact, when I moved to Jacksonville, my wife and I, we were, house hunting. And I told her, but she is obviously well aware of my, passion for climate change and my deep expertise in this area. I've been doing, climate change research for 20 years now. And I told her before we moved here, I said, we're not going to buy anything at the beach. We're not going to buy anything like that's close to the river. And yeah, it's not a good long-term real estate investment at all. And so, yeah, I wouldn't do it. I don't blame anybody for doing it. I mean, it's obviously a great lifestyle to live near the water. I would love to be able to live near the water, but just in terms of, for me personally, right? Again, right. I would rather not have that anxiety in my head about my property losing value. Other people might be more willing to take that risk, and that's fine. I don't, begrudge you, but I personally would not take that risk.
Okay, Richard, Richard, you are identified as Zoom user, so I'm happy I know who you are.
I changed it. Sorry, I had to get back out and in again. I forgot to rechange.
That's
my
okay.
name.
Don't worry about it.
That. Anyway, first a quick anecdote. When I retired out of a job at Mayport Navy Base, I was a State Department officer. But in the next 4 years after I retired, a building that had been fined for 40 years flooded twice. And I'm thinking that's going to be a major challenge for all of U.S. Navy bases around the United States. But secondly, I spent about 25 to 30 years looking at China. I'm quite confident that the projections for the fall of Chinese population are pretty accurate, that it will probably fall in half by the end of the century. How do we figure those calculations? I mean, losing perhaps 700 million bodies from China out of any of these climate change calculations.
Yeah, great questions. And just to talk about the Navy base anecdote that you were talking about, thank you for bringing that up. And something that's a big issue that the Navy is aware of. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's something like, 40% of Navy bases around the world. I mean, the United States Navy bases around the world are threatened with right. different levels of flooding in the next, several decades. And for Mayport specifically, I saw that their, own internal projection is that about 25% of the land of Naval Station Mayport are going to be threatened by flooding within the next several decades, right? So a quarter of the land area is with buildings and material and whatever is threatened by flooding, or is going to be threatened by flooding very soon. Now, as for the population decreases, you are right. Globally, we are expected to reach peak human population size. The latest estimate I saw was in the 2080s. Around 2086, there's about 8 billion people on the planet right now, and we are projected by the 2080s to reach about 10.5 billion people. And then the global human population is supposed to go down pretty steadily at that point. So lowering, in theory, lowering the number of people on the planet, through natural causes, not talking about, doing anything about it, making a decision to do that, right? But lowering the number of people on the planet through natural causes will be helpful to the climate situation. But there's a big caveat on that, which is that it's not really currently the number of people on the planet that are causing climate change, it's the lifestyle, right? Like, if everybody on the planet lived like, had the carbon footprint of somebody who lived in, Kenya, right? Like, climate change would not be an issue. Like, there is plenty of resources for everybody on the planet, currently all 8 billion of us, and we could live in a way that has a much lower carbon footprint, but it's just the lifestyles of Americans and Canadians and Europeans and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Australians, right? That's what's driving the situation. So yes, bringing the number of people going down would be good theoretically, but it wouldn't solve the problem necessarily because of the lifestyle issue.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Lance, you're up. Unmute.
Thank you. I was just thinking that if we all stopped eating hamburgers, we might be able to accommodate more people as well. Anyways, I wanted to ask about technology. I guess I'm a hopeless optimist. I watch things on the internet all the time about people cleaning up the ocean, about dimming, putting things in the atmosphere to keep the sunlight down, CO2 removal, sucking the poisons out of the air. You didn't mention anything about any of these. Is that because they're not real? Or are there real efforts? I know Bill Gates has invested in companies that suck CO2 out of the air. Again, it seems like a really good idea if it works. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lance. Thank you for bringing it up. Yes, so the things you're talking about are 100% real. What you're talking about with sucking CO2 out of the air is called direct carbon capture. And the technology exists. You can suck CO2 out of the air and you can turn it into a liquid and you can bury it deep underground. The technology exists. The problem with the technology is that there's really no way to deploy it at the scale that is necessary to have any kind of impact on the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the other problem is that if we were to deploy it at scale, running those machines requires electricity, right? And currently, most of the electricity on the planet is generated from fossil fuels. So you're basically burning CO2 to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's not the best solution for the problem that we face. And every single economic analysis I've seen of direct air capture, every single ecological analysis basically says that at this point, it is not feasible technology to use to have any kind of real impact on climate change. And that is going to be true for the next several decades at least. Maybe there'll be some big technological innovation where it becomes much more efficient and it becomes much easier to do and to use. And if that happens, I'm all for it. But at the current in the current state of technology that we have right now, it is not a feasible solution, despite all of the billions of dollars that are being poured into it.
But again, in 1976, my master's thesis was on solar energy, and I did that for the company Grumman Aerospace. And at that time, a panel, a photovoltaic panel, about a foot long, cost $10,000. Now I can go to a store here in Thailand and buy 5 times that panel for $10, right? So technology comes down in price, right? So this technology to suck the CO2 out of the air, if we put effort into it, could be brought down significantly, right?
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be funding any kind of research into the technology. What I'm saying is that we can't rely on it to solve the problem for us at the current moment.
What about dimming?
Okay, so dimming, what you're talking about is one of the geoengineering. If you're not familiar, geoengineering is this whole field where people are talking about these solutions for basically having less of the sun's energy hit the planet, right? And causing global warming in that way, because that's ultimately where the heat for the planet comes from. And again, those technologies are available. Those technologies, as far as I know, do work in terms of reducing the amount of sunlight that's hitting the planet. I personally am not a fan of geoengineering because the possible side effects are completely unknown, right? If you put a bunch of sulfur into the atmosphere to try to make more clouds, if you put, mirrors out in space to try to reflect more of the sun's energy, we really don't have a good idea of the side effects that could cause. For example, putting sulfur into the atmosphere to seed clouds. If there's more clouds in the atmosphere, it means that less of the sun's light is reaching the planet and causing global warming. But if we do that, it could have massive impacts on the rainfall systems around the planet. Like there are places that depend on a monsoon season, right, for their agriculture. And if we start playing around with the cloud cover, we could fundamentally change these weather systems that billions of people rely on for their food. And I think personally that is not a risk worth taking when the solution that would work is right in front of us, which is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Lance. I appreciate it. If you got more, you re-queued the way Susan did. I appreciate it very much. We've got a lot of people that want to have an opportunity. So David, and then Wendell, and then Jeanette. David, you're up.
Yeah, first, Adam, I wanted to say, I heard you give a related talk a couple of months ago out at UNF, which I found very impressive. And I thought this talk was even better. Of course, you had to change it for the audience, but it seems to me like you're getting better and better. So
Thank you.
I'm going to be following you for a while. My question has to do with the effect of global warming on the Gulf Stream. I've heard explanations and I never got it straight, but apparently it's going to have an effect on the Gulf Stream, which in turn has effect on the weather in Europe, in the United States, in South America. And of course, Florida is right alongside one of the directions of the Gulf Stream. So how does that work and how is that going to affect Florida?
Yeah, great question. So yes, what you've heard is true. The Gulf Stream is slowing down. For those of you who have never thought about the Gulf Stream before, the Gulf Stream is this massive current of water that runs north from the Caribbean up past the east coast of the United States, and then it cuts across the Atlantic Ocean over towards Europe. And it transports heat, right? It transports heat from the warm equatorial waters of the Atlantic and the Caribbean up towards the more northerly latitudes. And that current has moved at a certain speed for, thousands of years. And all of the evidence shows that current is slowing down. The reason that it's slowing down, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with you, but the melting of the Greenland ice sheets is causing huge amounts of cold fresh water to enter the ocean up in the northern Atlantic. And as that cold fresh water enters the northern Atlantic, it decreases the density of the salt in that salt water up there, and it's changes in the density of the salt that drives the Gulf Stream, right? As the water gets colder and as it moves towards the north, the density of the salinity changes, and then that water sinks to the bottom, and then it pulls water behind it, and that's what causes the current to work, right? So what's going to happen, to answer the second part of your question, is that as the Gulf Stream slows down, it means that less heat is going to be transported away from the Caribbean. And so that it's going to lead to an even faster acceleration of heating in the Caribbean, and it's going to lead to a cooling of the northern Atlantic, especially places like Britain, right? Like Britain is much warmer than it should be given its latitude. Like it's at the same latitude as central Canada, right? So Britain should be very, very cold. The reason it's not as cold as central Canada is because of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream brings heat to Britain. And so as less heat is transported that way, that part of Northern Europe is going to, it's not going to like cool down dramatically to like the point where, freezes over, right? But it's not going to be as warm as it has been for the last several thousand years.
Thank you for your answer. Wendell, do you have comment or question?
Hello, wonderful humans. Okay, I put a question in the chat, but I'll ask this. Will we as human beings ever get to the point where we put all of this stuff together and say, you know what? How about if we take a little break from the capitalism ownership concept type thing, and everyone doesn't have to go clock in somewhere and work to make somebody else wealthy, and then they're trying to find ways to cut wages and stuff. How about if, some of us got together and said, it would be great if I, stop participating. I don't want to take away anything from the capitalists or the temporarily embarrassed millionaires, the people who say, I will make my millions so that I could take care of me and myself and my family and all that good stuff. Those some of us that say, hey, if we could have a portion of the earth purchased, because people are going to say, you don't own it. How did you come to own it? And, if we could, say, hey, where was the first title deed registered? Because humans are the only ones with this ownership concept type thing, because animals don't pass down generational wealth. I mean, I haven't seen that on the Animal Planet. But anyway, when do you think, or how could you assist folk to say, we don't want to participate in this system any longer? If we could just have a piece of the earth to ourselves, we are not going to come to your movie theaters, we're not going to participate. All we're going to do is take the good earth and build some shelter and grow some food and just let you guys have at it. Just don't come and say, well, you've got valuable, well, I was at Mineral Things and we own the mineral rights, so we've got to move you, like how they did the natives on this part of the planet. They're like, oh, this reservation is yours. Sign this treaty. Then they discovered silver. They're like, no, that ain't good enough for you. We got to move you because we discovered silver. Then they found this, they put them on another piece of the planet. They go, oh, we discovered gold. This ain't good enough for you. So you have any suggestions as to if we could get the capitalists to say, hey, leave some of them alone?
Oh, I'm all for what you're talking about. And I agree with the basic premise of your comment and question, which is that capitalism is the ultimate cause of the problems that we're facing, not just climate change, but I mean, all of the environmental problems that we face are all, come back to their root is capitalism. And I talk with my students at UNF all the time about how the version of capitalism that we currently have is deeply flawed and is causing all of these problems. And we have discussions about, well, what would an alternative look like and how could we make that even happen? And to be honest with you, we don't really ever, I mean, I've thought about it a lot, and I don't know if it's possible to do that. I would love it if that could happen, but I don't know how you could actually politically or legally do that,
Are you familiar with the Venus Project, Jacques Fresco?
I've heard of it, but I don't know a lot about the details.
Right, I put the link up in the chat for anybody because he outlined, because he saw, his story as far as the little documentary. And I remember I was a child and I remembered all these things, the same things that he encountered. And he was older than I was. And he experienced those, the wars, the this, the that, the whatever, the starvation, the kids with the flies and the big stomachs. And I'm like, why do we keep doing this? And he outlined some great ideas for us to implement. And has anybody here seen Family Guy? I think one of the running lines was, why aren't we funding this? When they discovered something that actually was. So, yeah, if anybody's interested, we have ideas that we could kick around. Not because people want to keep their thing. They want to stay on the grind. They want to, keep their 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 4-car garage, whatever it is. Nobody wants to take anything from you. Just leave some of us alone. Don't get us.
But just to answer the second part of your question, we're talking about, can some group of people, band together and have just a piece of the earth where they're not being bothered by other folks? And the thing is, the problem is that climate change is a global issue that even if you were going to be able to separate yourself from capitalist society completely, that you would still be impacted by all the things we're talking about, right? So just taking yourself out of the equation and maybe a group of like-minded people out of the equation, it doesn't mean you're safe. Nowhere's safe, right? At this point, which is why the whole global human community has to work on this together.
Right. Was Thoreau onto something? Um, let's go to Jeanette. Jeanette, you're up.
I have a couple of questions that I wanted to kind of, I live along the Pottsburg Creek, and I also feed cats at the Unitarian Universalist Church. And I've noticed in the last couple of years that we seem to be having a lot more king tides. And I think that's what you're kind of talking about. And when you say sunshine,
Sunny
flood,
day flooding.
sunny day flooding.
Yeah.
And the king tides are huge. I mean, along the Pottsburg Creek here, they will go, there's a school where the bridge is on Atlantic Boulevard. They come all the way into the parking lot and the water comes in and takes huge, it's unbelievable, these tides. And I didn't know if anybody's measuring how frequently that's been happening. But at the church, the water comes all the way over. They've got a walkway, a kind of a nature kind of a thing, and it comes all the way up into the parking lot at the church. It's crazy. Which is
Yeah, and
not.
that's directly related to the sea level rise stuff that we were talking about, and that situation's only going to get worse. You know, when I showed that that map of the different parts of Jacksonville that are going to be flooding regularly by 2050, you know, that's not, some of that is hurricane related flooding, right? But a lot of that is what you're describing, right? Where it's
These are
king
not
tide related
hurricane
flooding.
related at all. These
Yeah,
are
it
just
has nothing to
like
do with hurricanes. It's just, you know, the
huge
amount
floods. You can
of sea
kayak in
level
a
rising.
parking lot. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you was, are you know, I'm sure you have but they're trying to add levels to the hurricanes now.
Yes,
I think they're trying to go all the way up to 8,
yes,
category 6, 7, and 8, because the hurricanes are getting so much stronger. And once
yes,
they get to 5, there's no delineation as
yes,
to how strong those winds are.
yes.
And one other thing, I know this is crazy because I wrote down, this has been a fascinating talk. I'm so, anyway. Oh, the red tides. You know, we've had more red tides, it seems to me, along the Gulf Coast. I know we occasionally have experienced some on the Atlantic side, but it seems like the ones that are the blooms that are happening on the Gulf Coast, they're more massive, they're worse, and I didn't know. That just cannot be a good thing anyway. And then the other thing I wanted to say is, why are we even still making water tank hot water heaters? When I had an electric hot water heater, this is just venting. I had an electric hot water heater put in, and it literally, just that hot water heater, this is not an exaggeration, cut my electric bill in half. I had no idea that a hot water heater burned that much electricity. And it was shocking to me. It literally paid for itself in 6 months.
Yeah.
And why are we even still selling water tank hot water heaters? I don't even understand why they are still a thing.
A
So
lot of
that's
it is, yeah, a lot of it. So the appliances you're talking about, I'm really glad that you were able to make that switch over. But you know, there are traditional hot water heaters, there are traditional air conditioning units, and then there is this whole class of, you know, appliances like that that rely on heat pump technology to generate heat instead of sort of the traditional version. And the reason that those kinds of technologies, which are widely available, and as you said, they pay for themselves, they you know, really are financially impactful on people's lives. But one of the main reasons that they're not more widespread is because there's a lot of inertia in those appliance industries. The people who install those things, the companies that make those things, they've been doing it the same way for, you know, what, 50 years, 100 years, right? And like I've talked to, you know, people who sell those kinds of things, and I'll be like, oh, well, like I would like to get the heat pump version of this, and they're like, oh, that's a bad investment, you know, like that's not gonna work for your home. And I'm like, that's not true at all. Like, so these people who are supposed to be the experts on these kinds of technologies, a lot of them are stuck in a certain way of thinking and not realizing that there's better versions of these things out there that would be better for their customers. So honestly, I think a lot of it is just inertia and a lack of education on the part of people who are installing these things.
Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you, Adam, for your answer. Jeanette, you evoked the term red tide, and I appreciate that. And Adam, you talked about voting. So perhaps we should consider voting for the blue tide. Fred, you're up.
Thank you. Excellent discussion so far. But one thing that I take part in a book group, and there's one member of our group, and everyone who takes part would know what I'm talking about, who adamantly denies. First, he used to adamantly deny climate change is a thing. He says, "Well, yeah, okay, it's getting hotter, but humans have nothing to do with it." And, well, there's been all these cycles throughout the billions of years, whatever, which he seems like immune to, and he calls himself a scientist. He seems immune to any rational logic. But also, a question about, because I live downtown, work downtown. You think the reason why it's more hotter downtown than other parts of Jacksonville is because so many more streets and concrete here, and is that the main part of that?
Yes, that's the main part of the answer. We know why different parts of the city, and this isn't unique in Jacksonville, this is in cities all over the world, have the same heat issues. And the parts of cities that are the hottest are the ones that have the, just as you were saying, they have the highest coverage of roads, parking lots, buildings, and they have the lowest amount of tree cover, basically. I mean, there's more to it than that, but those are kind of the big factors that that dictate what the temperature of a specific location is going to be. So parts of the city that have a lot of tree cover tend to be more shaded, tend to be cooler than parts like downtown, which don't have basically any tree cover.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, let's go to Susan and then to Henry. And if anybody else has comment or a question, now's the time to raise your emoji hand. Fred, you good with that? Thumbs up. All right.
I actually want to piggyback on what Fred said, which is that, and I'm really happy that this video is going to be available so that I can share it later with people, because I unfortunately have a really bad memory. But I'm around that same person that Fred mentioned, and I was wondering if our guest has like a 15-second spiel that we could say to global warming deniers, something that I could remember.
Yeah, great point. And sorry I didn't answer that question earlier, Fred. Thank you for bringing it back up, Susan. So when I said that you need to talk to people about climate change, I should have been more specific. You need to figure out who you can talk to about climate change, right? Because there are certain folks who are so set in their way of thinking about this as an issue that there's just really nothing you can say to them that is going to change their mind. No amount, and there have been psychologists and sociologists who have researched this exact issue, and there's no amount of data, right, that you can throw at a person or tell somebody for certain people that's going to change their minds. And those are the people who are the most usually tribalistic in their sort of belonging to a group, right? The research shows that people will sort of exclude all of the information from their brain that goes against whatever their group believes, right? Because they want to be part of the group. And if you start to take in other information, it means that you have to believe something different from your group, whichever group you're talking about. And that is something that most people don't want to do, right? Because we're social creatures and we want to be with other people and we want to be, on good terms with them, right? So the first thing is, if you encounter somebody like Fred and Susan is talking about, who it seems there is just no moving them at all, then really you shouldn't waste your time in talking to them about this issue, because there's nothing you can say, honestly, that's going to change their mind. What you need to do instead is figure out who are the people who are movable on this, who have some, just might not know enough about the issue or just need more information. Who are the people that in your life you have leverage with, right? Usually this is like family members, people that you're very emotionally close with. Those are the people who are going to trust you the most, right? So like a random neighbor who you never talk to, that's not the person to have this conversation with, because you're not a trusted person to them necessarily, right? So that you have to pick your battles, is what I'm trying to say. And then the other thing is, if you do want to have conversations with somebody about climate change, again, don't try to connect with them on a data-driven level. You have to try to connect with somebody on an emotional level. You have to figure out what what about climate change could be impacting them directly, right? Like when I talk to people who are military veterans, right? I don't talk about, I don't talk about coral reefs, right? I talk about threats to national security. Because as we were talking about earlier with David's question, or no, it wasn't David, sorry, it was Richard, with Richard's question. There are so many military installations across the planet that are threatened by climate change that's going to impact national security issues on a broad, number of levels, right? So when I'm talking to that community, I talk about national security. When I'm talking to farmers, right, I'm talking about drought, right? I'm talking about how drought is impacting crop yields and all that stuff. You have to tailor your message to the specific person or group that you're talking about. That's how you're going to have the biggest impact. And the other thing is recognizing that you are, as I said, you're not always you're not always the best messenger, right? There's an example. There's this woman, she's a world famous climate scientist. She's down at Texas Tech, and she is a evangelical Christian, right? So she can go into evangelical Christian communities and she can talk about climate change, and they will trust her because she is a member of their group, right? She's a trusted person. I am an agnostic Jew, right? Like I can't go into an evangelical Christian community and talk about this stuff because my opinion means nothing to me, right? So again, you have to think about, am I the best person to deliver this message? And you might not be.
Speaking of good people to deliver messages,
Wow,
make
that
a
looks
comment
really
or
cool.
two, if you would, on
How about the second half?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I'm speaking about good messengers.
What?
If you would, make a comment or two relative to Greta Thunberg.
Oh, I mean, she's doing amazing work. And her, getting mobilizing lots of young people across the globe is an incredible thing, right? I mean, and again, coming up at it from a perspective of trusted messengers, she might not be a trusted messenger for, large portions of the people who live on the planet, but she is talking to other young people. And the research shows that one of the biggest ways to influence people is to have kids talk to their parents, right? Children talking to their parents about a specific issue is a proven way to change the parent's mind about an issue. Not 100% of the time, right? But it's more likely to work than other people talking to that same group of parents. So the fact that Greta Thunberg is educating and mobilizing lots of young people is great just from that perspective alone. But also, I mean, she's just a very impressive voice of clarity on the issue, like the way that she talks to world leaders at, Davos and at the United Nations and everything. She's just very clear and to the point about it. And that's what we need at this point, because there's a lot of dancing around the subject of how dire the situation is. And we need more, truth telling.
How dare you? Henry M., you're up. Henry, are you with us? Henry M., if you're not there, we'll go to Henry? No, you muted yourself, Henry. Give Henry one more. Henry? We'll come back to you, Henry. Let's come back to Henry, okay? And we'll go to Wendell and then Richard. All right, Henry, we're coming back to you. Right now, you're muted. Wendell, you're up.
Thank you again, and I hope I didn't offend anyone, because some people love this capitalism thing. It's like crack. Not being offensive, but it's like I seen crack in the 80s, and that's what all people were about. But I comprehend that even though the few of us who would like to be away from the system, we're still in the pot, slowly, heating up. And the thing is to just have some shelter, grow some food, and let other people know that, hey, if you so desire, what you have to do is to re-educate yourself, question everything you were taught, that to be a valid human being, you've got to have some sort of credit score before you're worthy of being alive on the planet. Let's not harm each other. Let's just continue with our food and shelter thing. Don't harm anybody. Nobody's going to have a Lamborghini and somebody isn't. Nobody's going to have more square footage than they need. I've seen where, like, people, so to speak, formed a union, and everybody in the tribe got together, took resources from the surrounding area, and built them some shelter. It wasn't 92 gold-plated toilets, 400 bedrooms. It wasn't any such thing. It was the basic, and that's what some people are like, oh, we're gonna live in the huts and caves. And I comprehend it's so difficult. We are so invested. It's the sunk cost fallacy. Man, I can make it. I am worthy. I can do this. I can be a success if only I get this second job. Yeah. Plus, there's plate tectonics. So we are talking about shorelines. Who knows what nature has in store for us? Somebody's going to be like, man, I'm going to put these sand barriers, and that's going to keep nature out. Whenever nature is ready, the more you fight it, the more violent the reaction, because nature is doing its thing. Kind of like, uh, I don't know, is it like we are cancer and it's trying to survive, fighting us with our money system, because there are still people on the planet who do not participate. They don't have any cell phone bills. They don't have to worry about the price of anything. They just go take what they need, and anybody can take what they need if they've got an ache, a pain. And it's not like, oh, I own that tree, so you can't have those leaves unless you give me $5. But yeah, it's a whole thing. It's a slow process, and I plan on getting started soon, as soon as I get some money to purchase a piece of the earth. Thank you. You guys are wonderful.
Well, all right. Adam, do you have comments on Wendell Jackson Human?
No, I mean, I think that he put it all together.
All right, very good. Let's try Henry one more time. And Henry M., are you there? Henry? Henry, you're okay. All right, Henry, we can come back to you one more time, and then let's go to Richard. Richard Eason.
Yeah. Okay, one thing I would just comment on is that basically this planet is right now in a competition between state-controlled enterprises, centrally controlled enterprises, and capitalism. I think the Biden administration is ameliorating some of the worst aspects of capitalism at the moment, and that's a good thing. I don't think we have to pick our battles. I don't think we can try to bring down capitalism at the moment when so is Putin and so is Xi Jinping. They're trying to do exactly that. And in terms of picking your battles as well, we have, from what I understand, we have 65 religions in this country. Who's to say that any of them, which one of them is right, if any of them? And I guess the point is, never expect to walk into the Vatican and explain to the Pope why he's wrong. It's just not worth your time or your effort. You need to pick your battles. You need to find the people who are convincible in some way.
And I'll give you, thank you for that, Richard. I'll give you an example of that with my work with the Citizens Climate Lobby, where we go and talk to our elected representatives about climate legislation we want them to support. And so we've had a lot of conversations with John Rutherford, who represents most of Duval County and half of St. Johns County. And we've learned over the years that there are certain issues that he's immovable on, and there are others where he's more willing to listen to us about certain pieces of climate legislation that matter. So just as an example, we were trying to get him to support this bill that would have made it easier to deploy wind power across the country, and then to move the electricity generated by wind power to the places that need it the most. And he flat out told me to my face, it was a face-to-face meeting. He said, as I was describing the bill, he said, Adam, I'm going to stop you. I just need to tell you, I hate wind power. And I was like, okay, I don't, that's the end of the conversation, right? Like I can't talk to him about wind power because apparently he hates it. I'm not exactly certain why he hates it, but he hates it. And so we just don't talk to him about that anymore, right? We don't talk to him about an issue that he clearly is not going to move on. What we have learned over the years is that he is very willing to support pieces of climate legislation that support farmers moving away from more from climate destructive practices and more towards climate friendly practices. So he's actually co-sponsored 2 different bills related to making it easier for farmers to adopt those kinds of climate friendly practices. And he would not have known about those bills if we didn't bring them to his attention, right? So it's not a huge win. I'm not saying it's going to change the world, but it's like a little kind of bite around the edge that can sort of start to move somebody in the direction of being more of a helper than somebody who's hurting the situation.
But he's very concerned about military bases, so he doesn't want to have anything to happen to NAS Jackson Mayport if the
Yeah.
sea level rises and destroys their capability to be military bases.
Yeah, we talked to him about that as well, but he's not always able to connect it back to the climate risk, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Let's Susan, you're back. Your turn again.
Great, great, great. So I've asked this question before, and it's kind of controversial because, you know, I want to be a part of my tribe, but I don't understand the net metering thing. I'm forcing utilities companies to buy back solar energy at retail instead of wholesale, because if you do that, it seems like it gives an unfair edge to residential solar as compared to solar on farms. So can you briefly tell me why we should force utility companies to buy back solar energy at retail from residential units, with a net metering thing?
It's a great question. I am not an expert on net metering. So, you know, I'm not claiming that I have expertise in this area. But my assumption about why they might force utilities to buy it at retail instead of wholesale value is that they're trying to make it, you know, local governments, state governments, you know, whoever is instituting these kinds of regulations and laws, that they're trying to make it more attractive for homeowners to deploy solar on their roofs. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily fair to the utility companies, but you know, if it's going to lead to more deployment of rooftop solar, then that maybe is a net gain for, you know, the local region and for the, you know, country as a whole. Again, I'm not saying I'm an expert on this issue, but that's just my assumption about why people would maybe be proponents of that.
Oh, you okay with that answer, Susan? You have a follow-up? You're muted.
We're the consumer, so yeah, like it's FPNL, they may be profiting off that, but as a purchaser of these utilities, I feel like I'm subsidizing this price for people that bought solar panels, and I just don't really think it's fair. So I guess the answer, I mean, I know we have to all gather together and fight global warming, and whatever anybody can do to help, that's good. So I guess that's the public good comment of it. So I guess it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I rambled a bit. Sorry.
All right. I appreciate that. All right. Now, if we're getting ready to wind this down, and we want to be ready to appreciate Adam and everything he's given us in terms of his time, his energy, his insights, his wisdom. So I'd like to take another one or two questions and then conclude. So if you do have a question or a comment, now's the time.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, Henry.
Yeah.
Henry and Wendell, I know your hand is up, but let's see. I also know that Henry has had some technical difficulties in terms of his connection.
That's correct.
Henry, let's go to you. Thank you, Wendell, for pausing.
But you can hear me, right?
Right.
You
can't see you. We can't see you.
Thank you for being patient and calling on me a few times. I appreciate it. So I have two questions. One on extinction that our speaker mentioned, the mass extinction, and that we're in danger. When the extinction is caused by the volcano explosion or eruption, or asteroid, like old dinosaur was killed, not killed, died. That happens because volcano main component when it erupts, it's SO2, sulfur oxide. And that's created the cloud which enveloped the Earth, and the sun was not able to get through that. It's caused global cooling, no vegetation growth, and the death of all large mammals. That's number one. Number two, is that there is no correlation, statistically speaking, between the green gases and global temperature. All the models show no correlation. And it's acknowledged very widely because the main factor for climate change is the position of Earth with regard to sun and solar flux towards Earth. That is the only proven today factor which defines global warming. And the last one, methane and water vapor is about 50 and 100 times more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. CO2 possibly contributes to global warming, but these models are not predictive, which actually show that, and they do not work, and none of them actually was proven. Thank you. That's all.
So
Okay.
to answer your comments, the first one about the volcanic eruptions, you're right that volcanic eruptions can emit gases into the atmosphere that actually lead to global cooling. That is something that can happen. That's usually a short-term effect. There is a cooling effect, but it doesn't, at the most, it might last for like a few years. It usually doesn't last, very much longer than that. And, with eruptions that we've seen in our lifetimes, it's usually more like a few months where you might see that effect. But not every volcano puts the same kinds of gases into the atmosphere in the same amounts, right? So when I was talking about the end Permian mass extinction, that was caused by volcanic activity that was putting large amounts of greenhouse gases. And I'm not an expert on that part of Siberia where those volcanoes were, erupting at that time. So I don't know about the geology of that area, but all I know is that the data that, scientists have gathered about that time period show that it was greenhouse gases from those volcanoes that was leading to that climate change. And then to your second point, I don't know what data or models or that you're getting your information from. I don't know what you're relying on. All I can tell you is that you're incorrect. What I mean is there is a very clear and understood correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and warming. That's just a physical, that's a product of the physics. There's no real arguing with that. And so, yeah, your statement about, climate change only being caused by the position of the sun and by orbital cycles, it can be influenced by that for sure. But that's not what's causing what's going on right now.
Very good. Thank you, Adam. And let's go to our last question, again, back to Wendell. And Wendell, we're going to ask you to please make it brief, concise, and to the point.
Okay. Are you guys familiar with cobblers, shoe cobblers? Okay.
No.
Shoe cobblers. Guys, usually it was guys that used to repair and make,
You're talking about the cobblers who made shoes.
right.
You
If
said,
they had-
oh, yes, of course. Yeah, we
right,
know.
shoe cobbler. If they had a great lobby, a set of good lobbyists, Nike, Reebok would have been paying them 5 cents for each shoe sold. Unfortunately, they don't. And basically, Susan was lamenting about the power companies saying, hey, we're losing money. So they either, because like it's all different states where they're proposing that anybody that sells power back to the system, they would pay taxes on that or whatever it is. And it's like, granted, that's the thing. The individuals, they're putting solar, they're paying that money to try to save some money, not to stay what you call, paying money. They're trying to reduce their bills and stuff. But yet you're going to want to put, pass legislation because the electric companies are saying, we're losing money. Well, that's it. You got to go out of business. Simple. Just like the cobblers are no longer on every street corner. It is what it is. Capitalism, that's what it is. Thank you. I shut up.
All right, Wendell. Adam, any comments relative to shoe cobblers and what Wendell?
No, but I thank Wendell for his comments for sure.
Okay. Well, Adam, one of the things you said that I took a vague note early on. You said Hiroshima-sized bombs for Hiroshima. And I might correct me if I misquote you, but 4 Hiroshima-sized bombs every second, is what is creating all the heat?
That's the amount of heat that is being trapped on the planet by the greenhouse gases.
Right, and so it's 4 Hiroshima-sized bombs every second. So
Every
here's my
second.
question: why aren't we already all dead?
The reason we're not already all dead is because the Earth is massive. And so that amount of heat, I mean, it sounds like a lot, right? And that it is a lot of heat.
Exactly. It's a great stat.
It's a great stat, but it is a lot of heat. But the Earth is so massive, right? That even with that amount of heat being added every second of every day for 60 years, it takes a long time to add up and really influence things. And part of what I was talking about before, the reason that it's taken a long time for the heat to really build up and for us to notice the heat building up is because a lot of that heat, 90% of that heat, ends up in the ocean, right? So it's not always a temperature. It's not like it's been influencing the temperature that we feel on our skin in a dramatic way for 60 straight years. It's had to build up in the ocean for a long time for it to then cycle back and influence the air temperature.
Okay, I understand that. I appreciate that.
Because you also have to remember that the oceans are massive, right? And like they have a lot of heat holding capacity.
And they're deep and massive.
Exactly.
They're just not massive in a tropical area. They're deep, and
yes.
so.
Yes.
I don't know, how deep does the heat go?
The heat goes all the way down to the bottom, but it doesn't affect the area of the ocean that's most affected by the heat is what I showed on that graph. It's down to about 2,000 meters. So that's about 7,000 feet or so roughly. But the oceans go all the way down to 35,000 feet, right, at the deepest parts of the ocean. So that part of the ocean has seen very, very small changes probably in heat, but nothing really serious. It's really the top 7,000 feet that we've seen most of the heat change take place.
Do you think we're sort of like the frog that is put into the pot of water and the water starts to boil and the frog doesn't realize that the frog is about to die?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. Yeah,
is that a fair analogy of what you've described tonight?
Yeah, it's the perfect analogy. Just to give you an example, Louisiana is a place that has always been hot and is getting hotter. And some reporter asked one of the representatives from Louisiana in Congress, a guy named Steve Scalise, they asked him about whether he was concerned about, this was during last summer, right, when there were all these heat records being broken all across the world and all across the country. And some reporter asked Steve Scalise from Louisiana about whether he was concerned about the heat wave that was going on in Louisiana at that time. And he just said, why are you asking me this question? It's always been hot in Louisiana, right? So he is literally the frog, right? He's like, I grew up in a hot place. And just because it's a little bit hotter, I'm not concerned about it. So that's it.
Well, right. And eventually, the frog could jump out of the water, out of the pot any time, but the frog doesn't. It just sits there.
Yeah.
And the water gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then the frog is no longer, and that's that. Another species extinct.
Yeah.
Do you own a violin?
Do I own a violin?
Yes.
No, I do not.
Well, because I wondered if you would be the one playing the violin as the Titanic sank. Or would you be the one, or would you be the one on the deck saying, "Look out, there's an iceberg"?
I'd be the one trying to find something to float on.
Okay. Well, Adam, I want to thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your wisdom, and everything that you've said tonight, and everybody who's joined us tonight. I want to thank all of you. So we want to show our appreciation to Adam in any way you can. If you'd like, you can unmute your mic and say something, or give a hand clap or a thumbs up or whatever. But Adam, I very much appreciate it, and I wish you the best. And I'm glad you are in Jacksonville helping us with Mayor Deegan and everything else you're doing with the Resiliency Project. You've got a big career ahead of you. You're, in some ways, and by the way, I really, Adam, I don't want to take anything away from what you've done, but personally, I think one of the highlights was cameo from your son.
Because
All right,
he's
so-
the motivation.
He is the motivation. That's right.
Right. Yes, he's the motivation.
Well,
So
thank you very much for the kind
Adam.
words. Thanks for having
Good
me.
night,
I really
everybody.
enjoyed meeting you all. And,
Everybody.
yeah, I'll hope to see you around Jacksonville sometime.
Thank you, Adam.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.